watches from high above. I dream of peace for one and all, on the land I love. Cornwall, Cornwall is where I'll be. It's dark blue night, it's cold and rain. Cornwall, Cornwall is home to me. It's blue, sad and shivering. I break old sleep on the land I love. The sun shines warm and bright from above. Some breezes blow, the daylight show. Be the land I love. Cornwall, Cornwall is where I'll be. These dark blue nights, golden days. Cornwall, Cornwall is home to me. This jewel set in a shivering sea.
Well, I can remember my grandparents. They came out from Cornwall, but they had 2 or 3 children that came out with them. And the boats, sailing ships in those days came into Port Adelaide. Some of the ships came around the peninsula and came into Moonta Bay, but some of them, they came up by bullock wagon or coach, whatever was available from Adelaide. And on my father, this was on my mother's side, and on father's side, they came out and they went to Burra and Barrow area. And when Moonta was found in 1861 by Paddy Ryan, of course there was an influx of the miners from various parts of Australia. Well, my father's father, he came from Burra to Moonta. But mother's parents, they came out direct from Camborne in Cornwall area.
You're arriving out in this new colony of South Australia. You're issued with a tent and a pick and a shovel, so you set yourself up in Adelaide and you wait for the work to start. You see early etchings of Adelaide. That's what it is a tent city. Governor Gawler had the government house built, the police barracks, quite a few buildings around the city, spent all the money in the treasury, and it's not long before he's heading back to England. Time Governor Grey arrived, the colony is almost bankrupt. All the hopes and dreams of coming out here to start a new way of life is ending up starving in a tent. But mining saved the day. They found some silver, lead and zinc at Glen Osmond in 1841. That caused a fair bit of excitement. A couple of years later, Bagot and Dutton found copper at Kapunda. The uncle knew what the sample was, bought the 80 acres, and it yielded him £1 million worth of copper. I think everybody thought we were stupid to try and go farming. We should be out looking for minerals. 12 months after Kapunda, Thomas Pickett, the shepherd, is finding copper down here that measured 17 feet in diameter. A couple of weeks later, another shepherd in those hills out there is finding another sample, and the governor's saying it hasn't been surveyed yet. There's about 20,000 acres. Who's got £20,000 in gold coin? You can have the whole lot. Nobody had that sort of money in this state in 1845, so 2 syndicates were formed. They called them Knobs and Snobs. The Knobs were Bagot and Dutton from Kapunda, and the Snobs were the shopkeepers of Adelaide. The governor got his money in, drew straws, and they got half each. Bagot and Dutton got the mine out south of Burra, which only yielded £7,000. The shopkeepers got this one, which yielded £5 million. Their £5 shares were soon worth $315 each, and they received 800% return on their investment. The mine went for 33 years. So these young shopkeepers upgraded their places along Highney Street and Rundle Street, built their beautiful homes, made donations to churches and colleges, and the city of Adelaide could lift itself out of being a tent city into a lovely city of churches.
The greatest Cornish tradition that the cousin Jacks brought with them to Australia was their mining tradition. And this harks back to the 18th, the 19th century, when Cornwall was the land of tin and copper. And at that time it led the world. There was what is known in Cornwall as the Great Migration out of the county. The Great Migration to the New World, and principally to the copper mines of the New World. To the United States of America, to South America, to the West Indies, to South Africa, and to Australia and New Zealand. And in Australia, overwhelmingly, the migration was to South Australia, because South Australia had that which the Cornish prized so much, good copper mines.
Burra was set up in 1845 as the first company town of Australia. The first area they organised was a square out here where they sold you water at a shilling a bucket, which was fairly expensive. You trade your horses and bullocks, any other goods and chattels. All that trading took place in the market square. They tell me a woman was traded for 2 gallons of beer one hot Saturday afternoon, so an interesting sight. And in the evenings, the Cornish and the Welsh, great fellows for fighting and wrestling, they were able to rope off this square, and you'd have 200 or 300 men out here a couple of times a week having their fighting and wrestling matches. So it's been pretty important with the Cornish miners when they arrived that they found a bit of shelter, and the obvious place was to dig yourself a dugout along the banks of the creek. And up to 2,000 of them found themselves living in conditions like this in these dugouts. And you imagine work getting back overseas. Come on, dear, there's plenty of work in the new colony and I've got a house all ready for you. So dear would come out, a nightmare trip on the boat, arrive in Adelaide. Sometimes you'd be lucky enough to get a ride as far as Gawler, but most times they walk the whole distance. And I really can't see dear being too impressed. She's come 12,000 miles to live here in the banks of a creek in her dugouts. The Cornishman were about 5 feet and his wife was about 4'10", so they just made the dugouts big enough to get into. The chimney pots always caused a few problems. It was very tempting for children to run along the banks of the creek and drop down a few stones down this chimney pot, or maybe a lump of mud, or worse still, a cow pad. Christmas time, you had to sandguard over your roast chicken or your steamed pudding, otherwise a piece of wire would come down that chimney pot and your Christmas lunch would disappear. Or if you're very naughty, you block the whole chimney pot off and smoke the whole family out. There's a letter in the archives, a fellow writing back to relations saying in this new colony, he's got an 8-room cottage, he's got a river out the front, and he doesn't have to pay any rent. I think he might have been one of our first real estate agents, actually. In 1848, the miners here in Burra are out on strike. Everybody seems to think the first strike in this country was the Eureka Stockade on the goldfields of 1854. But in 1848, these miners are gathering the market square because their wages had been cut. So the secretary of the company, Mr. Henry Ayres, decides, in an effort to get them to go back to work, to cut off the water supply down there in the square and the supply at the butcher's shop and the baker's shop. He says in his journal, a few hundred starving men sitting around the city of Adelaide, they'd be glad to go to Burra to work for 27 and 6. So the troopers were dispatched and they had to come up here and move the workforce out and put another lot in. Now the strike only lasts for a few days because it's the middle of summer and here's the community cut off from the water supply. So the miners go back to work for that reduced wage. The registered newspaper a week or so later criticises Henry in an editorial and says, you're pretty tough on those fellas, they work in shocking conditions, come home and live in a hole in the ground and you're still squeezing their wages down further. Can't you give them a bit of a fair go? Now Henry got a little bit upset about that editorial, so the newspaper was banned and we weren't allowed to have our own little newspaper till the company pulled out 31 years later.
He was always spoken as that there man up to mine, and was a personality in those days. Mothers trying to get a flock of unwilling children to bed would say, "You childer best be going to bed, or else you'll be having that there man up along to mine peeking in the window at 'ee." One little chap stands, legs wide apart, mouth open, eyes staring at that there man. "Whatever be the matter, why, Tommy? What be ye glaring up along like that for? Why, when that there man do hear the clock strike 12, he'd a come down and run all round the town. However do he get up along again? Goes along home with thee, thou girt bufflehead. Whenever did that there man hear clock strike?
Pan NCO Tiski about teas all the drum bees, so re scorpions and yake canoe, and around re scorpions bras in Gurno. In Gurno, tis a woffin of this prag a rate to Tiski canoe. How gorth it, you, I also force canoes. How prags will be force canoes. How the couples net is store here, how etas bras. Best low enough iguales a my store an hashman or Bill Waft in Australia. Maltessen, my brave against in Kurno, Bill War.
Cornish people in general regard themselves as essentially different from the English people, and their sense of difference stems from their Celtic background. The Celtic background relates to the so-called Celtic fringe, which is made up of Cornwall and Wales and Ireland, the Isles of Man, and also includes Brittany. And it was here that the Celts were driven virtually by the Anglo-Saxons when they invaded the United Kingdom. So the Cornish have clung to the early Celtic traditions. They regard England as being upcountry. If you cross the Tamar River, you move into a foreign land.
I love my anthems, every old doing all. I'm brave and proud for to be here with you all. It is a real joy to be here, ladies and gentlemen, in Australia's little Cornwall, and it was a very moving experience this morning when we were up at the Moonton Mines, just to stand there and think that Cornish people had been here so long before us and spoken in our lovely Cornish dialect and brought their wonderful sense of humour with them. My soul, said someone, look at he. He's bating on for 83, never moved in his life for, says Cousin Grace, and now he's going like a donkey race. I didn't stop nor hesitate, but jumped the nearest 5-bar gate. Now Myrtle May and Liza Jane, they took to leg down through Ed Lane. First door they come to, knack, knack, knack. Hey, missus, can we go out your back? Why, yes, there's something matter, yo. We felt the call and gotta go.
Leading our dignitaries, we have Mr. and Mrs. Grace Williams, the President of the St.Ives West Committee, Mr. and Mrs. John Alston, the opposition, Mr. and Mrs. Tempwood.
Australia's little Cornwall became the second great concentration of the Cornish in Australia, second after Burra, but it became the biggest concentration. And its heyday was the 1870s. The 1870s because of the good copper prices throughout the world at that time. It was 3 towns, the towns of Kadina, Wallaroo and Moota, obligingly provided by the government to stimulate the mining industry. And Moota Mines was probably the best example of the Cornish in Australia. In the 1870s, it consisted of some 6,000 miners and their families living in small limestone cottages. The haphazard landscape of the Moota mines was dotted by mine shafts, by mine chimneys, by mining engine houses, and by goats.
Rosie.
£2.10 behind a week, and the fowls was given a
The miners kept
£2.10 a week
goats for milk, and this was a reflection of the fact that water on the mines was always very difficult to obtain. It was sold for 2pence a bucket. This was expensive. Miners in their cottages used to dig underground dams to collect the runoff after the occasional rains. So water was a problem. Wood was also a problem. The timber was valuable in the mines, valuable for burning in the boilers, which created the steam for the use of the big engine houses, meant that the landscape around Moota Mines, the landscape around all of what became known as the Copper Triangle of the 3 towns, Wallaroo, Moota and Kadina, the landscape has been completely denuded of the original mallee vegetation because it was used in the mines. The Moota Mines landscape of the 1870s was crowded, too crowded, and it was the children who suffered most from this overcrowding because there are instances of typhoid fever where as many as 111 children died in a single week. Methodism groups came to South Australia with the Cornish miners, and they established themselves in strength in Australia's little Cornwall. It came from the heart. It was an emotional sort of religion characterised by preachers who ranted and raved from the pulpit and who injected into their audience a fervour, a response of hallelujah, God be praised, and a great deal of emotion associated with the whole religious outpouring of the preacher. And the local preachers were the mining captains invariably, and indeed it was almost a way to assure promotion throughout the mines, to be seen as a good Methodist. Within the mine workforce, there was a hierarchy which started with picky boys, sometimes 8, 9, 10 or 11 years of age, whose job was to simply work on the surface. They weren't allowed to go underground, but they worked on the surface, breaking up the ore. Above the picky boys, there were the tut workers, the people who did basic sort of work in the mine, sinking the shafts in the main. But if you were a miner of any class at all, you aspired to be a tributor. And a tributor was very much a person who worked by his wits, because he struck a contract with the mine captains, a contract to shift a certain amount of ore, generally in a period of about 4 weeks. The value of the ore was worked out, and then the tributor was paid accordingly.
The old miners, now these that came out from Cornwall, they were the men that used the hammer and drill. Now those men didn't suffer from dust on the lung like their children did. My father's group of folks, a few of them came out with their parents. Most of them were born out here, we'll say in the 80s, early 80s, late 70s and early 80s and early 90s. Those men, when they went down underground, this is the first generation of men that were born out here, they used machines. They had an air compressor, and of course it was a fairly big contraption and fairly weighty, and had 2 handles on it, and those men would use those machines. Now they made a lot of dust, whereas with a hammer and drill there's no dust. It's the men that worked on the machines that suffered what they call minus phthisis, that is dust in the lungs. Now my uncle came home from Mullerone Mines. He'd been day shift and I happened to be there, and he wore a thing like a respirator over his nose and mouth all the time they were working in the stope. And this caught this black muck that was coming from the machines they were using for drilling. And I watched Uncle take this out of his bag and he put it in a bowl of water. I suppose there was 1.5 gallons of water in the bowl, and he rinsed it out, and that looked like ink. He threw it out. He had 3 waters, and the third one, it was brown, and the 4th water was clean. And I watched him, never spoke. Well, when he had this clean water to finish up, I said, "How much of that stuff, Uncle, would get through into your lung?" He said, "I hope none." But he said, "I'm only hopeful. I'm afraid some has."
It was a decent pasty if it reached from your knee to your mouth when you sat down. Now, one half was mainly vegetables you could grow yourselves: potato, turnip, trombone, sometimes a scrap of meat, not very often because it was too expensive. A very thick piece of pastry in the middle, and the other half was stewed apples or stewed quinces, or sometimes some jam and currants. So you had your main course and your sweets all in the one pasty. The test of the cook was to be able to get the pasty to the mine, and the book tells me drop it 50 fathoms. So the pastry had to be tough enough to survive that fall, yet not tough enough to kill your husband or son with indigestion for the rest of the week. The rats were a bit of a problem. You see pictures of miners with a piece of string around the trouser leg that stops the rats from running up your leg while you're working, and the women packed these pasties into very large calico plough bags, and they could nail them to the roofs of the cabins in between meals to keep the rats away.
Well, they say a real Cornish pasty only have white vegetables in it, but we make them with potato, onion, trombone or pumpkin, and a little bit of parsley and meat. The pastry, well, I use plain flour, and the dripping that I have been, say, baking a roast or something like that in it, and that gives it flavour to go into the pastry. Well, then we add a little bit of salt. Some people like to put a bit of pepper in it, but Father, he hasn't been able to take pepper, so I don't put pepper in.
Pastry rolled out like a plate, piled with turmits, tates and meat, doubled up and baked like fate. That's a Cornish pasty.
Round the table we did spread, eating up the round head. Tom and Dick and Sue and May on Kevin's feasting day. Uncles, aunts and cousins more, some had trips the brer long way, come to pick a bone for sure on St. Kevin's feasting day. Oh, how we all did grin when the rambucks had come in. Oh, Dad was all tucked in on Kevin's feasting day. When we did the buck's head greed, Father made a speech to we. All the forth was short and sweet on St. Kevin's feasting day. Oh, how we all did grin when the rambucks had come in. Oh, Dad was all tucked in on Kevin's feasting day. Round the table we did spread, eating up the rambuck's head. Tom and Dick and Sue and May on Kevin's feasting day.
And that's the last feasting song that's been sung in Cornwall up to date, at present time. That's the only one left.